Greetings and welcome to the Black Madonna Speaks with me, your host, Stephanie Georgieff, author of the Black Madonna Mysterious Soul Companion. Please be sure to like the Heart of the Black Madonna on Facebook, subscribe to this channel, and follow me on Twitter. And the handle is at BL Madonna for updates on tours, talks, and publications. At the time of this recording, we're in the first few weeks of Lent for both Eastern and Western Christianity. It is also a time that the world is reacting to yet another tragedy of violence and terror perpetrated on innocent people as they gather to worship. In the West, we seem to focus more on acts of random violence and evil in the news. And unfortunately, they are happening with increasing frequency on our familiar shores. There are various reasons for this, but the shooting and murder of people in churches, synagogues, and mosques, when they happen in Western Europe and North America, always seem to receive quite a bit of news time and space. These tragedies happening with alarming frequency in Africa, the Middle East, and throughout Asia. But for some reason, we do not seem to be exposed to such events with the same intensity as we do when something happens in the Western world. At the time of this recording, we are in the aftermath of a terrible tragedy that occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand. While I find the incident vile and incredibly sad, what strikes me as I listen to all the responses to this tragedy is the repeating statement of, "This does not happen in New Zealand," because New Zealand seems as an isolated isle of peace and tranquility when compared to the rest of the world. What is it about evil that we think it only happens in certain places and to certain people? And why was this community targeted? What is it about Islam that inspires such actions against its people? And the deeper question for me as a Christian is, what is the relationship between Christianity and Islam? And how do we peacefully and respectfully coexist? The three great world religions that have come from the area, which is now called the Middle East, are also called religion of the book. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are these three great religions. It's interesting how each religion has an affinity for Jerusalem, claiming territory and historical events for their faiths to this relatively small backwater town. For the Jews, Jerusalem is their spiritual capital, the home of the great Temple of Solomon and the seat of their ancient empire, the land that was promised to them by God himself. For Christians, Jerusalem is the site of the great deed of Christ, the events of Holy Week, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the site of the great revelation that their prophet Muhammad received and the place where he ascended to heaven. The Christians and Muslims fought over the city of Jerusalem for several centuries, which ignited the Crusades. The Jews reclaimed Jerusalem and Israel as their own state, their homeland after the horrors of World War II, and have in essence been fighting with the Islamic world since the creation of the modern state of Israel in the 1940s. And this happens to this day. The people of each religion are guilty of harming the other throughout history. And who harms who really depends on the states of various empires, wars, and occupation. Each group is very well versed in the oppression they have experienced at the hands of the other. But often, each group does not recognize or apologize for the violence and oppression that they have expressed on the other group. and are always trying to justify the targeting and violating of the other group because of past or perceived wrongs. Islam is the youngest of these three religions. Judaism emerged about 6,000 years ago, Christianity about 2,000 years ago, and Islam about 1,400 years ago. It's also interesting how Christianity built itself upon Judaism and how Islam recognizes prophets and scriptures from both Jewish and Christian traditions. In fact, the sacred text of Islam, the Quran, mentions both Jesus Christ and his mother Mary, as well as numerous Hebrew prophets and fathers, such as Abraham and Isaac. Something I found interesting was that the Quran actually mentions Mary more times than the New Testament. In the Quran, Mary's story is related in 3 Meccan chapters and 4 Medinian chapters. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Quran, there are 2 parts to the Quran. There's the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad when he was in Medina, and the Quran that was revealed when he was in Mecca. And that's why they call them the Meccan and the Median chapters. There's also a chapter called Surat Murian, or book, that is within the Quran. The virgin birth of Jesus is supremely important in Islam as one of the most important miracles of God. There are numerous Annunciation stories involving the Archangel Gabriel and Mary, which those of us in the Christian world would definitely recognize, specifically from the Luke Gospel. The Quran states that Mary remained pure while God allowed a life to shape itself inside her womb. According to the Quran, Mary was chosen twice by the Lord. And there's a verse that says, "O Mary, verily Allah has chosen you and purified you and chosen you above all the women of the world." It is interesting that the Archangel Gabriel is involved in both Christian and Islamic scriptures as the angel which brought the great news, or the Annunciation, to Mary as a revelation of the coming of Jesus. I also think it's interesting that the Archangel Gabriel is, according to Islamic tradition, is the angel that revealed the verses of the Quran to Muhammad. As I said before, Mary is one of the most honored figures in Islamic theology, with the majority of Muslims viewing her as one of the most righteous women to have lived. There are also a minority of people, specifically women in Islamic tradition, that view her as a female prophet. Muslim women look upon Mary as an example, and traditionally they are known to visit both Muslim and Christian shrines in her honor. In the Muslim tradition, they honor her memory in the city outside of Cairo called Monserrat. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. And they also visit something called the Bath of Mary in Jerusalem. What I find interesting about the city Matriaya in Cairo is that we know from the New Testament that Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus fled to Egypt in order to escape the threat from King Herod. This city outside of Cairo is associated with the pharaohs, but is also part of the ancient city of Heliopolis. Heliopolis is the city where the Holy Family lived while in exile. The word Heliopolis means city of the sun. The city also has one of the very few original standing obelisks from the ancient era that remains in its original site. And for those of you who have been to the Vatican City, especially St. Peter's Square, the obelisk in the center of the Windrose compass is actually from this city. A legend of Maitreya also states that the Holy Family sheltered under a palm tree while living in exile in Heliopolis. And there is a tree that is claimed to be the actual tree which is now in a sacred chapel of the Virgin in this city. In my opinion, a common misconception is that Christianity is new religion for the Middle East and Africa. This misconception is that European invaders brought the religion to the region in the 17th century during the terrible age of conquest and slavery. In actuality, Christianity first flourished in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And it was the centuries of constant warfare from the Mongols and later the Ottomans that wiped out Christianity in these regions. The other historical fact is that most of the ancient and medieval Black Madonnas were brought to the European continent from these regions. And they were brought from these regions to the continent starting in the 4th century from the monks from North Africa. And the largest numbers arrived in the bags and caravans of returning Crusaders and Knights Templar during the Middle Ages. Throughout Spain, the more ancient Black Madonnas were hidden in caves and buried underground during the Arab invasions of the Iberian Peninsula in the 7th and 8th century. These Black Madonnas were discovered centuries later through various legendary events. One of the more famous ones is the Virgin of Guadalupe in Spain. And she was actually buried next to the river Guadalupe, near Guadalupe. It's actually a town, and was discovered by a cow herder who was looking for his missing cow, and he thought the cow had died, so he tried to at least take the skin of this dead cow, and as soon as he put a knife into the cow immediately stood up and started mooing, and through various actions and visions, this cow herder realized that there was this Black Madonna, and he started digging and found this statue that you see before you. So this is one example of an ancient Black Madonna being rediscovered. And another one is probably the most famous Spanish Black Madonna, the Madonna of Monserrat, who we think actually came from the Holy Land through the hands of St. Helen of the Cross and made her way into the Iberian Peninsula. And in an attempt to save her from the invading hordes, they put her in a cave up in the Montserrat Mountains. And several centuries after they put her in this cave, a group of shepherds saw a beautiful beam of light coming out from the mountains and heard music. And when they went up to discover the source, then they saw this cave and they found this beautiful Madonna, which is still on display today. And you can also go to the cave and shrines where she was discovered. So there's all these interesting threads between the Holy Lands, the what are now considered Muslim lands, and the Black Madonna. But also what's very interesting to me is the large tradition venerating the Virgin Mary in Islam. So let's look at all these threads connecting the Black Madonnas and Islam. What struck me most when I was doing the research for this video was that the legends and lore surrounding the Virgin Mary many of these legends, which people, particularly in the Catholic world, are very familiar with a lot of these legends that aren't necessarily in the New Testament, they actually are found in Islamic texts. And I find this very interesting. The fact that so many of these images, which are venerated in Europe, had their origins in Islamic lands. This is also striking to me. But the one thing that speaks to me personally is how these dark images of the Virgin Mary are one way of seeing divinity in those with dark skin, and how important this concept is for the Christian population of Europe. Excuse me. If you practice medicine as I do, you actually do not see people as colored or from different groups when you deal with them and their health. You see them as human beings. You also witness the deep similarities we all have. All humans, regardless of where they come from, their ethnic heritages or how they worship, they all desire to be loved. They all want to have a home, to provide for their families, to feel successful, and that all peoples, they all bleed. They can become sick and they can die. In my practice as an acupuncturist, I help people from all religions to become pregnant. My patients came from the Jewish tradition, the Mormon tradition, Catholicism. Some were agnostics. They were Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, and Protestants. All of these people wanted to have families, and they all said the same things when they were trying to get pregnant, how much it meant to them, and also how disappointed they were when they weren't able to get pregnant. And then when they did get pregnant and give birth, the utter joy that each one of them experienced when they held their babies for the first time. I noticed no difference, regardless of religion or ethnic background or race, when it came to these life thresholds. It was quite an education for me, an exposure to how similar we all are, and how we all feel the same pain and triumphs in light. When it comes to the Black Madonna in Islam, we can see how so many similarities and gifts from the Islamic world in terms of our understanding of the veneration of the Virgin Mary. That so many of these beloved images actually came from the Islamic world can also give us a glimpse of the message of inclusion and community, that at our hearts, we are all part of the beloved community. Please join me in reaching out to those who are different, those who worship differently. Ask them questions. Offer hospitality. One of the greatest quotes that inspires me personally was given by St. Francis of Assisi to his missionaries who were going to the Holy Land during the Crusades. Preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. And may the peace that passes all understanding permeate our wounded hearts. And may this peace we give to one another help quell the inspiration that ignites the tragic acts that target the innocent. Help us contribute to our fellow human beings' feelings of safety and security and value and dignity. We can do this together. Blessings on your journey.